thank you very much for coming out on a beautiful May afternoon, fishing opener here in Minnesota. We have two concluding lectures on the series today. One, I would like to cover really what is called the Viet Minh War, which is the period really during World War II down to 1954, and the division of Vietnam into North Vietnam and South Vietnam along this parallel. And then in the second lecture, we'll talk about what is usually called in America the Vietnam War, which goes really from, it starts sort of 1955 after the division of the country and goes until 1975. Now, I apologize up front because so many things happened in all these years that we really can't cover everything. But what I want to do is I want to talk about the high points, the key events, and I want to make one thesis. And my thesis about the whole issue of communism and the Vietnam Wars is that basically the Vietnamese communists and the French and then the American anti-war movement betrayed the Vietnamese people. The sequence went from the communists to making a deal with the French, which influenced the American anti-war movement, which finally won over the American people, and we abandoned the Vietnamese nationalists. And that's really the story of happened, and that explains why there are Vietnamese refugees in America and why the situation in Vietnam is still one of a dictatorship, of a ruling elite which the people don't like. Now, let me go back to where we left off. And the first part of this lecture on the Viet Minh War is the beginning of World War II. Because something happens in World War II which sets the stage for these wars. Something happens which gives the communists an opportunity to take power. And then what happens is a struggle between the communists and the nationalists. And foreign powers, the French, the Americans, the Chinese, and the Russians, get involved, helping one side or the other. Now, as you remember, in World War II, there were two theaters of operation. There were really two separate wars. One was in Europe, and it involved primarily the Germans and Hitler and his Nazi party, and to some extent the Italians with Mussolini. But the Italians were a small part of the European theater. In Europe, the war began and was caused by Hitler's aggressions. He wanted to master Europe. So he attacked first Poland, or he took over Czechoslovakia, and then he attacked Poland, and then he attacked France, and then he attacked Russia, and then the allies of the French, the British, started fighting him, so he started bombing England, and then he declares war in the United States, so the United States then goes to war in Europe. Now, in Asia, there was a different war, which was started by the Japanese, with an attack on Pearl Harbor primarily, but previously, the Japanese had expanded into Manchuria. They had taken over a large part in the late 1930s. They'd taken over large parts of China and set up a puppet government, Chinese who were working for them. And they had their eye on Indonesia and the oil and the rubber of Indonesia. And it was Franklin Roosevelt who declared an embargo against the Japanese to punish them for going into Vietnam. They went into Vietnam here as a stepping stone to go down to Indonesia. And, but by the time the Japanese went to Vietnam, there had been a change in the French government in France because of the European War. What had happened was Hitler had conquered France. And the sort of the legitimate French government was defeated. And many of the Frenchmen who didn't like the Nazis ran away, like Charles de Gaulle. And they were in Africa or they were in exile. There was a French government under Marshal Pétain, which moved the capital from Paris to a little town called Vichy. So it's called the Vichy government. And it ruled France as a puppet government. The French administrators running Vietnam followed Vichy. They were loyal, if you will, to the Nazis. Now the Nazis and the Japanese formed an alliance, the Fascist Alliance. So the Japanese said to the French administrators here, in effect, we are your allies. We want to bring our troops into Vietnam. And the French could not say no. So the Japanese begin to bring some troops into Vietnam, but they do not want to administer Vietnam. They do not have enough soldiers to take over Vietnam and run it as a colony. So they leave the French VC administration in place. And then they move their troops from here down to the attack on Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia. They strike a similar arrangement with Thailand. They support a kind of a fascist military guy, Pibun, in Thailand. And then they go into Burma, and they try to attack India from Burma. So that happens in 1939. What this means is that there are new opportunities for the different political points of view within within Vietnam, sorry. The different Vietnamese points of view. Now remember, I argued in the previous lecture that the Vietnamese had three responses, really, to French colonialism in the West. One response was to become very traditional, to just ignore the West and European learning and go back either into Mandarin customs or family customs or the Wahao Buddhist religion or the new Cao Dai religion. Another response was to go with the West, to adopt Western thinking and Western ways of organizing. One branch of that became French constitutionalists. Another branch of that was the communist. Because I pointed out communism is a Western theory. And Ho Chi Minh and the leading communists were mostly sons of mandarins from central Vietnam who studied in French schools. Ho Chi Minh learned about Marxist-Leninism in Paris. Marxist-Leninism is a Western approach. It's not Vietnamese. It has no roots in Vietnam at all. And class struggle, which comes in with communism, is a Western concept. It's not a Vietnamese concept. And then the third alternative was sort of the nationalists, who were trying to recover a sense of Vietnamese ethnic identity, Vietnamese nationalism, Vietnamese heroism, Vietnamese values. Things about Phuc Duc, an issue of Viet Minh, a sense of individual fate, and being able to, for every individual, to enjoy a kind of freedom so that their fate could develop as much as it possibly could. And a sense that Vietnam has its own destiny under heaven. So how did these three groups respond? Well, a number of the traditionalists, the Wahao and the Cao Dai, sought Japanese protection. A number of the nationalists, particularly the Dai Viets and others, also sought Japanese protection. A few Vietnamese stayed with the French, but not many. And the communist Vietnamese aligned with the Allies. They aligned with the Americans and, to some odd sense, the Free French and the British and Chiang Kai-shek's Chinese and the Russians, because those were the Allied powers of World War II. And what happened was, now in the late 1930s, as the rivalry between Hitler and Stalin in Europe began to get more and more serious, and Stalin realized that Hitler might betray him, Stalin gave orders through the Communist International that the immediate objective of communist parties was to go into an alliance with the bourgeois middle-class parties. They were to give up class struggle for the workers and the peasants on a temporary basis in order to make an alliance with the middle class, the bourgeoisie, and fight the fascists. So in 1941, there's a meeting of the Vietnamese Communist Party. And the man who was to become Ho Chi Minh shows up, but he's not the Secretary General. Nguyen Van Cơ is the Secretary General, and the senior guy is called Lê Duẩn. And there's the 8th plenum of the party, and they begin to plan the anti-fascist alliance. So that means they're beginning to plan a way of fighting against the Japanese in Vietnam. Whereas the Wahao, the Cao Dai, the Dai Viets, and some of the VNQDD, they are with the Japanese. Now, what is not remembered very much these days, particularly in America, is the Japanese had a strategy and a policy for East Asia. Part of their war aims had a cultural and political dimension. And what they proposed to all the Asian peoples was to set up something called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. It was going to be a union of all the Asian peoples. And they actually had some meetings. And they supported political leaders in Indonesia, in the Philippines, in China, in Burma, a number of places. And they supported people in Thailand, and they supported Vietnamese. Now, one of the principles that the Japanese proposed behind the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere was no whites. No white people in Asia. Asia is for Asian people, not for white people. And there were a lot of Asians who actually responded to that in the Philippines, in Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, Burma, elsewhere. The Japanese were so cruel to the Chinese, though, that they never got the Chinese to kind of cooperate with them. But this was the Japanese context. And so you had a number of Vietnamese allied with the Japanese, and this small group of communists allied with the Chinese, the Russians, some of the Free French, the Americans, and the British. Now, nothing much happens for a couple of years. However, in 1941, there's another meeting, and the Chinese convened the Vietnamese communists and some other groups, and they create a group called the Viet Minh. Actually, it's Vietnam Dom Minh Dap Lap Hoi. The Vietnamese Allied Independence League or group or association, Hoi. And then later on, another Chinese general created a rival group of Vietnamese exiles who were affiliated with the VNQDD. And that group was called the Dom Minh Hoi, the Allied Association. So we see the use of this word Dom Minh, which literally means allies. Now, I think that word gives rise to two interpretations or understandings among ordinary Vietnamese. One is it's Dom Minh, it's we Vietnamese allied with each other. And the decision was made by the communists, of course, not to present the Communist Party as the political movement. And I want to argue in a couple of points. It's because they know the Vietnamese don't like communism. Vietnamese will fight for Vietnam. They won't fight for communism. Communism is antithetical to Vietnamese values. But Dom Minh, so it means all us Vietnamese together against the Japanese. Dom Minh also means allies. And who were the allies? If you talk about Dom Minh in those days, that meant the Allied powers. So what this Viet Minh group was saying was, we are the local Vietnamese representatives of the Americans, the British, the Chinese, the Russians, and the Free French. In other words, behind us, we have a lot of foreign power. This is the concept of Tay, of power. And I mentioned how the ruling strategy in Vietnam under the Nguyen dynasty, from which these Viet communist leaders came, basically, from Mandarin families, was the use of power combined with an ideology. So here we see in 1941, the communists creating a power structure behind their backs. Then in 1944, there is a bigger conference, and a new leader emerges. And this guy has a name, Ho Chi Minh. And no one really knows who he is. And it was suggested that by the Chinese patron of this, a General Ching Fa Kuei, that you need a new name. So he takes this name, Ho Chi Minh. He's been in a Chinese jail for a couple of years. And there's lots of complicated negotiations and betrayals. It's very hard to figure out what was actually going on. But he's released and shows up at this conference. He's presented as the leader of the Viet Minh. Now, he tells other people he's been using the name Nguyen Ai Quoc, Nguyen who loves his country. And then starting in 45, he's going to tell all the Vietnamese people, and the Communist Party is, oh, this man, Ho Chi Minh, he used to be Nguyen Ai Quoc. Now, what we said in the previous lecture was Nguyen Ai Quoc was the name, the pen name, associated with a column, in an anti-colonialist French column in a French newspaper. And various individual Vietnamese, Phan Chu Trinh and others, would write the column under the name Nguyen Ai Quoc. And that name, Nguyen Ai Quoc, had a certain resonance with Vietnamese. Oh yeah, those, either somebody or those people, they, in the 1920s, were standing up against the French. So it had good quality. Now, Ho Chi Minh means Ho who shows the way to enlightenment. There's another possibility, and the man is dead, so we can't ask him. But the use of the word Minh, or enlightened, or light, or intelligence, might be strategically very significant. Because we talked about before how with the Wahao and with a lot of other groups, there was this hope for, and we even saw this, I think, in the letter from Nguyen Wei, there's this hope for a Minh Chu, a Minh Chua, a Minh Wang, an enlightened emperor, an enlightened Lord, an enlightened master who would come down from heaven and bring peace, happiness, and independence to Vietnam and get rid of all these bad guys in the Trinh, Nguyen, all these other families. And so if you take the name Minh, this probably for ordinary people resonates as somebody special. Now the significant thing to me is this man, as he becomes Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh, they don't talk about communism. They don't go to the Vietnamese people and say, communism is the way to your future. What they say is, we want to bring Vietnamese together, I'm an enlightened guy, and I've got the allies on my side. Now, something very important happens in late 44, early 45. I can't remember the month precisely, but Ho Chi Minh is able to establish contact with the Americans, with the American Secret Service. It's called the OSS, Office of Strategic Services, in Kunming, China. The OSS was the predecessor of the CIA. And Ho Chi Minh, through an intermediary, goes up and meets with some OSS people and meets General Chennault. He asked for me, the famous General Chennault, the American general, the Flying Tigers. He put together the Americans who volunteered to go to China before we were in the war and fly airplanes for Chiang Kai-shek against the Japanese. And one of the things Ho Chi Minh's asked for is he wants a picture of General Chennault, which he gets signed. So he takes us back to his cave, his base in North Vietnam, and in the ensuing months, as people from Hanoi and others come up to check out this guy, who is this Ho Chi Minh? What do they see on his bookshelf here? They see the picture of an American general. What's the political message that this sends to Vietnamese? It's, I've got Tay, I've got Claire Chennault on my side, and you don't. So I'm the guy with power. Whether you like me or not, you got to listen to me. And the deal he proposes, the deal Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh propose, because actually the Viet Minh, they've got a couple of forces up along here. They basically are inconsequential. They have maybe a couple of battalions of soldiers under General Giap, and they've recruited some hill tribe people under Chu Van Tung. But at this point, the war is getting closer, and the Americans are starting to bomb the Japanese in Indochina. And American pilots, every once in a while, are getting shot down. Ho Chi Minh proposes to the OSS that his Viet Minh will go find the American pilots, if they're shot down, rescue them, and bring them out to China. And the OSS says, good deal, thank you. In return, he wants some advisors and some weapons. So the OSS gives him 5,000 rifles, which allows him to organize the first Viet Minh military unit. And the DEER team, some American advisors, go in to start training his Viet Minh in how to use the rifles and small unit tactics. But basically, not much has happened. The French want to arrest the leader of the Wahao, Win Fu Shou, but he's protected by the Japanese. Now, in March 1945, the next great step happens. The Japanese decide to take over direct power. They are afraid that the Americans, who have now landed in the Philippines, the American strategy, as you may remember, is to march up the islands towards Japan, which is up there. So the Americans have landed in the Philippines, and the Japanese feared that the next American move might be a landing on Vietnam. Actually, that was not in the American plans at all. Vietnam was a sideshow. But the Japanese thought this. So they overthrew the French government in Vietnam in March 1945. And they install a government of Vietnamese nationalists, primarily. Dai Viets and people related to the Dai Viets. And sort of an important point for later is that there's a young man by the name of Ngo Dinh Diem who was proposed to be prime minister because he's anti-French and he has a reputation for being a hard worker, but he's very stubborn. And so the Japanese say, no, we don't want him. So they bring back a professor, Professor Trung Trum Kim from Singapore, and they set up a Vietnamese government with a lot of Dai Viet support, but they do not give them any guns. And I once talked to a member, Mr. Trung Văn Chương, who was the minister, I think, of education in that cabinet. And I said, well, so what happened? And he said, well, we were promised an army. That's why we agreed to serve as a government under the Japanese, because we figured if they give us an army, even if they lose the war, we then have an army and we can fight the French and keep them from coming back. But they betrayed us. They never gave, we had a government in name only, but we never had guns, we never had an army. So they start doing things. There's also, there's an argument about this. The communists say because of rich landlords, the facts seem to indicate bad Japanese planning and bad weather. There's a failure of the harvest here. So a lot of poor Vietnamese are starving, and many die allegedly of starvation. Though people argue about this, and the facts I don't think are that clear. But the government, the Trung Trum Chim government, is trying to deal with this. The next thing that happens is the Americans drop an atomic bomb on Hiroshima on August 9th. And basically, everybody knows that the Japanese are finished. So what this means in Vietnam is there's a power vacuum. It means two things. It means, one, there's a power vacuum. The people who have a lot of power in Vietnam, the Japanese, they have the soldiers, they have the guns. They're going to lose. The Vietnamese government has no army. Secondly, the Vietnamese who have allied with the Japanese have now lost their Tay. They're with the loser. So the Wahao, the Cao Dai, the Dai Viet, and others, there are various kinds of Dai Viets, they now, in terms of Vietnamese politics, they don't have a lot of prestige. They've lost their Tay, and the Allies are going to come in. The Allies are not going to give them power. The Allies are not going to help those guys. So there is a meeting of the communist leadership right after August 9th. And a decision is made to go for a coup d'etat, an urban coup d'etat, a putsch. Now, this is significant because in after years, the communists in Vietnam developed this great reputation for representing the peasants, the workers, the guerrilla movement, the villagers. Their first move to power had nothing to do with villagers or workers or peasants. They had no support. It's estimated that they had only maybe 25,000 Vietnamese in the Communist Party structure by this point. Nguyen Phu Cho had over 1 million. So if you compare Ho Chi Minh to Nguyen Phu Cho, who was the stronger, more powerful Vietnamese? Who had more appeal to the people? Nguyen Phu Cho. But where did the idea come from for this tiny minority to strike out and seize national power through a coup d'etat in a city? The answer to that is twofold. The first answer is obvious. Lenin. The Lenin-Stalinist model was to seize power in the city. That's what Lenin did in 1917 in St. Petersburg. His Bolshevik party was a small party. It was not a large mass party, and it was not even a majority of anything, but they were tough. And they seized the government from the moderates, from Kerensky. And they started a civil war, and they ended up winning the civil war. But they started by seizing power in St. Petersburg and declaring themselves the government. So, Ho Chi Minh and, the second aspect is more Vietnamese, and it's explained by Lê Duẩn. And this is one of the books of Lê Duẩn writings. And Lê Duẩn was really probably, as we learn more and more about what really happened inside the Communist Party, he's probably going to come out as the key man responsible for the communist takeover of Vietnam. This guy, Lê Duẩn. And he's not a nice guy. He's not a warm, fuzzy guy. He writes in here, and his big thesis is about the Thai Ca, the opportune moment. Thai is time, Ca is opportunity. Politics and revolution is all about taking advantage of the Thai Ca, not organizing the people. You wait for, and think how Vietnamese this is. You wait for fate. It's very Vietnamese. You wait for fate to give you an opportunity, and then you strike. And if fate presents the opportunity and you don't strike, you're a loser, and that's your fault. So even though you may be a minority, if fate comes down to you, you take advantage of what fate brings, and you strike, and you gain power. You don't talk about legitimacy. You don't talk about right and wrong. You just talk about seizing the opportunity. So this theory of the Thai Ca will also explain the strategy of the communists against the French and against the South Vietnamese and against the Americans. And it actually, if you think about it, it explains what they're doing right now. Everything since '75 under the communists follows a philosophy of Tay and the Thai Ca. So they seize power in Hanoi. And the next thing they do is they call upon Emperor Bao Dai to abdicate. And the argument made to Bao Dai is that his dynasty is finished. The French are going to come back. The only way to stop the French is to bring in the Americans. Only Ho Chi Minh has the Americans. And by the way, an American OSS major, Archimedes Paddy, who wrote a great big fat book about what a wonderful nationalist guy Ho Chi Minh was, shows up in Hanoi with Ho Chi Minh. And Ho Chi Minh parades him around. As evidence to the Vietnamese, I got the Americans. I'm the key guy. And Bao Dai, I read in another book, it said he sent a telegram to the new American president asking, is it really true that Ho Chi Minh is your protege? And of course, the telegram never gets to Washington, and even if it did, the Americans, they don't know anything about Ho Chi Minh or Bao Dai, really. So Bao Dai decides to abdicate. I am ready to make any and every sacrifice. For these I wish my sacrifice to be useful to the fatherland. In the present crisis, unity is life, division is death. That the urge for democracy of the people of the North has risen too high, and if I kept waiting until the opening session of the National Congress, friction between the North and South would be inevitable. Such a conflict would cause more suffering to our countrymen and afford exploitable opportunity to foreigners. As for myself, during the 20 years of my reign, I have tasted much bitterness. Now I feel happy to become a free citizen of an independent country. I will never allow anyone to utilize my name or the name of the royal family to deceive our countrymen. Long live the independence of Vietnam. Long live our democratic republic. Signed, Hue Kieng Trum Palace, 24 August 1945. Then on September 2nd, there's the famous Declaration of Independence of Vietnam in Hanoi by Ho Chi Minh. Oh, I'm sorry, there's one more important point I forgot. When the Viet Minh make the coup d'etat in Hanoi in early August, that night, according to this book, which is the history of the Quốc Dân Đảng Party, that night there's a meeting of the nationalists in Hanoi, including the Dai Viet leader, Trung Tu An, and Quốc Dân Đảng and other people, to make a decision as to what to do about the communist putsch. And because the Dai Viets and the Quốc Dân, they have armed people in Hanoi. They have armed units too, and they have their friends, the Japanese, and the Japanese still have military units in Hanoi. But the group under the leadership of Trung Tu An makes a decision not to fight back because they do not want to shed Vietnamese blood. They do not want Vietnamese to kill each other. And that, I submit to you, is the older tradition of Vietnamese virtue. You can't get Phuc Duc, you can't get good wheat in if you go around killing people. So Ho Chi Minh reads the famous Declaration of Independence. Why is it famous? Because later on, the French and the American anti-war movement noticed two things he said. This is how he begins. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This immortal statement was made in the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America in 1776. Now, if we enlarge the sphere of our thoughts, this statement conveys another meaning. All the peoples on the earth are equal from birth. All the peoples have a right to live, be happy, and free. The Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen of the French Revolution of 1791 also states, all men are born free and with equal rights and must always be free and have equal rights. These are undeniable truths. So he leads his statement of independence with a reference to the American Declaration of Independence and the Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen from the French Revolution. So people have said for a long time that proves that Ho Chi Minh is a patriot and a Democrat and not really a communist. Now, my assessment is that if you're a shrewd Vietnamese and your one key to power is American support, what do? You align yourself with the Americans. You show everybody, you've got your Americans standing right here, and you show people that you borrow from the American Declaration of Independence. And it's also true that the Viet Minh is a non-communist group allied with the Americans, the French, the Russians, and the Chinese. So then, very interesting to me, this is September 2nd. Okay, on September 5th, 5 days later, and this is from the official government registry of Ho Chi Minh's government, the Vietnam Young Quoc Công Báo, the Vietnamese People's Republic official newspaper. And it says, Ra Sac Lin, issuing an order. Point number 1, the Dai Viet Quốc gia Xã hội Đảng and the Dai Viet Quốc dân Đảng are abolished. 3 days after they come to power, they abolish their political rivals. They say you cannot have a party. Second point, if these two parties continue to meet and operate, then all those who are guilty will be brought before the court for very serious punishment. The ministers of Interior, Defense, and Justice have responsibility for implementing this order. Signed, the Minister of Interior, Vong Nguyen Giap. So one of the first moves of the communists is to declare illegal their opponents. I think that's fairly significant. They're not interested really in a big united front of bringing all Vietnamese together. They're interested in power for themselves, right from the start. On the importance of the American support, I heard a story from a much older Vietnamese man in Hue. I heard this story maybe in 1970, 1971, and he was describing to me the abdication of Bao Dai and what people thought. And it turned out that one day, an American plane landed at the airport in Hue, and on this plane, as I don't know if you know it, there's on the side of planes, if generals fly in trucks or fly in planes or drive jeeps, there's the flag of a general, which is put there. And then a general's flag in the U.S. Army is a red flag with gold stars. 1 star for a 1-star general, 2 for 1 star for a brigadier general, 2 for a major general, 3 for lieutenant general, 4 for a general. And we had a Brigadier General Gallagher in Vietnam at the time to supervise taking guns away from the Japanese. And so the story of this Vietnamese guy is this American plane lands, and on the side of it is a red flag with a gold star. That's the Viet Minh flag. So the Viet Minh in Hue said, see, the Americans are flying our flag. They are our friends. And all the other Vietnamese in Hue kind of believe, what are you going to do? Got an American plane, you don't speak any English, they don't speak any Vietnamese. American plane lands, it's got a flag on it, red flag, gold star. Sounds pretty persuasive. Now, at this point, right at that time, a Frenchman, Jean Saint-Denis, arrives in Hanoi. And this man, Jean Saint-Denis, I want to talk about because he is, I think, the great betrayer of Vietnam. And Saint-Denis was the son-in-law of one of the former French governor generals. But he was a free French. He was fairly close to de Gaulle. Now, at the end of World War II, one of de Gaulle's ambitions is to restore the French power around the world. And in the French mind, Indochina was a great jewel in their colonial empire. But as of March 1945, they don't control it. Cambodia is independent, Laos is independent, Vietnam is independent. De Gaulle wants it back. So he sends Saint-Denis out to China in the middle of 1945 to figure out how to get Vietnam back. And Saint-Denis flies into Hanoi with the American OSS team. But he reports in one of his books, basically, nobody will talk to him. No Vietnamese will talk to him, except, as we will see, Ho Chi Minh. So Saint-Denis is there trying to figure out a way to bring back the French. The Allies in World War II have other plans. There are still many Japanese troops in Vietnam. So it's decided by the Allies, I think at Yalta, that Chinese forces of Chiang Kai-shek will come down to North Vietnam, collect all the Japanese, take their guns away, put them together and send them back to Japan. And British forces will come down to South Vietnam and do the same thing here. So starting in September 1945, Chinese troops are coming in here, British troops are coming back here. Now, again, quite revealing, Ho Chi Minh organizes Gold Week, Dong Lei Vang. And he says to all the people, particularly the women of North Vietnam, give your gold to the cause, to the country. We need money to buy weapons. And most of the Vietnamese who are patriotic, they do this. My mother-in-law turned over apparently a whole bunch of gold. So Ho Chi Minh and the communists take all this gold, and Chiang Kai-shek's general, who's flying in, is General Lu Hang. And guess who gets most of the gold? Chinese General Lu Hang. And there's another story that as he's coming down from the plane at the airport, Ho Chi Minh goes out and gives him a gold opium pipe as a symbol of friendship. Lu Hang thereupon patronizes Ho Chi Minh and the Viet. So now Ho Chi Minh has switched from the Americans to the Chinese, as the Chinese now have the power in North Vietnam. In North Vietnam, in the fall of '45, the Communist Party and the Viet Minh start organizing, and there are several military training camps out here of the nationalists, the Dai Viet and the Vien Cu Di. And so the Viet Minh and Ho Chi Minh start to attack these camps. They fail. They cannot defeat the nationalist troops. An election is held, coalitions are movement, arguments that the election is rigged. It's one of those things where if you didn't get your election card validated, you wouldn't get food handouts from the government. So it was interesting. In the South, meanwhile, now remember, Cochin China, from here down is direct French territory, dominated by the French. People living down here are French citizens. There are many rich Vietnamese landlord families who basically are close to the French, have no interest at all in the Viet Minh or the communists. They then persuade the British general to round up all the Japanese and give guns back to the French. So the French now start to have their own police control here, and fighting starts between the French and various Viet Minh and other Vietnamese nationalists down in this area here. We now get to early 1946. This is where Saint-Denis begins to play an important role. In early 1946, the Frenchman who's a commander here, who's very conservative, Darjen Lu, doesn't quite know what to do. So he goes back to Paris to get instructions from de Gaulle and the French government. What's the plan? What are we going to do? Now, in the interim, de Gaulle has sent out to Saigon his #1 general, Leclerc. Leclerc was the great hero of the Free French forces. He led the march on Paris. He liberated Paris from the Germans, and de Gaulle sent him out here to retake Indochina for France. So he has Leclerc, his military man. He's got Saint-Denis, his political guy. But there's a problem. There are no French troops. De Gaulle is desperately arguing mostly with the Americans for ships. He needs to send French soldiers from France to Indochina, but the French have no navy. The Americans have all the ships. And he's demanding that the Americans give him ships to move the French soldiers back to Vietnam, and the Americans refuse. Not for any policy reasons in Vietnam, but because they have to get some 14 million or whatever it was, I don't know how many, millions and millions of American soldiers back home. Because the war was over in September. It's now January, and the American people are demanding, we want the boys home. So if you can imagine, you've got these, literally hundreds of thousands of Americans all over the place, and you got to get them on ships, you got to get them back, you got to get the tanks back. It was a tremendously draining logistics operation, and we had no time to loan ships to de Gaulle. So Leclerc has got a problem. How does he reconquer Indochina if he's got no troops? A proposal is made by a number of people, primarily by Santini, that we cut a deal with Ho Chi Minh. We cut a deal with the communists. None of the other Vietnamese want us back. Bao Dai doesn't want us back. Nobody else wants us back. Cao Dai don't want us back. The Wahao don't want us. The nationalists hate us. Who is our ally? Now, there was a rival point of view. The rival point of view was to use the same strategy that the French had adopted in the 1890s and 1900, which is an alliance with the Catholics, the landlords, and mandarins. And the conservative French colonialists here argued that let's go back to the old way. Let's just make a deal with those Vietnamese who have an economic interest or a religious interest in helping France, and we'll rule Vietnam with them. Another theory was argued on behalf of Santini by a man by the name of Paul Meuse. Paul Meuse was a French scholar who was supposed to be one of the great scholars of Chinese Confucianism and Vietnam. And he argued, no, we cannot go to the old way. There has been a revolution in Vietnamese and Chinese. It's Cat Mang. There has been a change in the mandate of heaven. What had happened to Meuse is that he had been here when the Japanese took over from the French, and he'd fled up into China. And Vietnamese had helped him get up into China, but he saw a complete reversal and change in their attitude towards the French. From an attitude of colonial submission, they were no longer submissive. They didn't kill him, they were perfectly friendly, they were decent to him, but they did not have any respect for the French or French education. Vietnam was back. So he had this sense that sort of, if you will, heaven and earth had inverted themselves. And if the French were going to maintain power in Vietnam, they needed a new strategy. Point number two. Vietnamese, according to Meuse, this goes back, were fundamentally Confucian. The huge French mistake about the Vietnamese, which goes back to the 19th century. Vietnamese are primarily Confucian Chinese. They operate in terms of an ideology, a logical structured ideology. If there's going to be a revolution and the old Confucianism is dead, what's the new ideology that's going to come into Vietnam and take the place of Confucianism? Marxism. The Vietnamese are going to go from Confucian to Marxist. They're going to go from one kind of ideology to another. Now, ladies and gentlemen, what did Paul Meuse leave out of the equation? Being Vietnamese. He had no idea. He lived in Vietnam for, I don't know, 20, 30 years by this point. He had no real emotional understanding of Dai Viet, of the Li, of the Trung dynasty, of Lê Lai, of Nguyen Huệ, of Nguyen Thai, all these Vietnamese things we've been talking about in these lectures. The guy hadn't a clue. He sort of did, but he had, like so many Frenchmen, he'd subordinated it and suppressed it under this image that the Vietnamese are sort of Neo-Confucian. So Paul Meuse has the theoretical argument to support Santini's practical argument, to support Leclerc's need to somehow cut a deal, to get the French back. So negotiations are conducted with Ho Chi Minh, and they're successful. In March 1946 is the first great betrayal of the Vietnamese people by the communists and the French, but the French can't betray the Vietnamese people. They're not Vietnamese. They just want to conquer it. And a deal is made between the Viet Minh government, Ho Chi Minh has a government, and the French, that the French will recognize Vietnam as an independent country and Ho Chi Minh's government as the only legitimate government of the Vietnamese. In return for which, Ho Chi Minh agrees that the French army can come back to central Vietnam and North Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh allows the French to bring their troops back. They cannot fight him. They used politics and diplomacy, and they cut a deal. They say to Ho Chi Minh, we recognize you as the great Vietnamese leader, as the George Washington of Vietnam, and you, in return, allow us, little deal, we get to bring our troops back, and other issues we'll talk about in the future. The details we will talk about in the future. So this is the famous March Accord. Now, why would Ho Chi Minh do this if he's really a nationalist? Well, there is another precedent, ladies and gentlemen, going back to Lenin. There was the Brest-Litovsk treaty. Lenin, by the way, was sent back into Russia in early 1917, I think, by the German Kaiser, by the Germans, to take the Russians out of the war. By this point, the Kaiser, the Germans in World War I, realized that if they had to fight the Russians on one side and the French and the British and the Americans on the other side, they can't win. What they needed to do was stop the war with the Russians, bring all their troops from here over to the Western Front and hold off the French, the Americans, and the British. But they had to get the Russians out of the war. How to do that? Well, Lenin promised. Lenin's communist Bolsheviks were arguing for peace. He was arguing that the war was an imperialist evil, and if he came to power, there would be peace. He'd just get out. So they send him back. He does take power, and he keeps his word. And in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, he takes Russia out of the war, and he concedes to the Germans huge amounts of former Russian land in Poland and elsewhere. So it is argued that maybe he lets the Russian people down, but he gets the Communist Party in power and recognized. So Ho and his communists do the same thing with the French in March of 1946. A story I was told later by Professor Wee was that a few months later, French troops are marching from Haiphong up into Hanoi. And Ho Chi Minh and Giap are standing in a second-story window looking down in the streets. Oh, by the way, in order to make sure that the Vietnamese would go out on the street to welcome the French, the government put out the fact that that day was Ho Chi Minh's birthday. So Ho Chi Minh's birthday is supposed to be May 19th, I think. So all the people were told to go out on the street to celebrate Ho Chi Minh's birthday, and the French come walking down and they say, wow, all these people are out here to welcome us. So anyway, so Giap allegedly is looking down on this with Ho, and he's getting pissed. Oh no, he sees some French guy. He sees some French guy down there kind of push a Vietnamese guy aside. He just push it out of the way, buddy. And so Giap says he swears or something like that. He says, Tang Tuk Young Sam. And so Ho Chi Minh then says to him, he says, Chú không dựa vào nó, thì chú dựa vào ai? If you're not going to rely on them, who's got your back? You know, if we don't have the French on our side, who we got? So this has come down in sort of the folklore. But it gets to this analysis that Ho Chi Minh was using the concept of Tay. We're going to use these guys. So the French come back, Central and North Vietnam. What happens next? What happens next is the murders. The murders begin. The communists and the French team up, and they start killing Vietnamese nationalists. And this begins years and years and years of bloodshed. And for example, one of the, I mentioned some of this before, is Trung Tu An, the founder of the Dai Viet Party. This is a biography of Bui Diem, who was South Vietnam's ambassador in Washington for many years. In here he talks about the day when Trung Tu An, Bui Diem was a Dai Viet, a northern Dai Viet. He talks about the day when Trung Tu An disappears. This book, the Quốc Kinh Đảng, this is a history of the Quốc Kinh Đảng Party. I forget how many pages, but roughly, all these pages right there are about all the VNQDD people who were murdered by the communists. And they go through it village by village, district by district, listing by name all these VNQDD guys who were killed by the communists. This is a more recent autobiography from Pham Van Lieu. Pham Van Lieu was a young Dai Viet VNQDD officer in one of their military training camps up here, and he talks about the murders, he talks about the attacks, how they ultimately had to flee to China. Lieu comes, he's the founder of the South Vietnamese Marines, Tuy Kum Lục Chien. Quite an interesting guy. So Ho Chi Minh and his government start negotiating with the French on the one hand, at Dalat, and then later at Fontainebleau in Paris, while Giap and the other people and the French are eliminating the nationalists. Ngo Dinh Coi, the older brother of Ngo Dinh Diem, a non-political Catholic, is murdered. In Da Nang, I was visiting Da Nang once, and there was a Cao Dai temple there, and I said, I didn't know the Cao Dai are down here, but they had a pretty big temple up there. So I went in there, and there's this whole wall filled with pictures of older men in white, whole wall, floor to ceiling. I sort of said, oh, who are those? He said, well, those are all the Lixi, Those are all the martyrs. So 3,000 Cao Dai were murdered by the communists in Da Nang in 1946. So at the end, in the fall of 1946, oh, I'm sorry, one more thing. This is, I think, absolutely key to understanding what Ho Chi Minh and his party were doing. They also murdered all the Trotskyites. This is a minor point in history, but it's terribly significant. They murdered Da Tu Tao. The Trotskyites, as some people may know, were sort of left-wing anti-Stalinists. They were left-wing communists who followed Trotsky. Trotsky had had a big falling out with Stalin, and Stalin had him murdered in Mexico. The Vietnamese had one of the largest Trotskyite parties in the world. There were a lot of Trots here in the US, but the Vietnamese had a lot of Trotskyites. Most of them were murdered in 1946. They were fellow communists, but they were not Stalinists. They were not part of the organization of the Indochinese Communist Party, as it was called then. And so this party in early 46 is taking advantage of opportunities to win control. Now, I have had a sort of a difficult time over the years just trying to understand how a group of people could be so bloodthirsty. But there was a previous example, actually, that was brought to my mind a couple of years ago, which we talked about briefly. When the Trung dynasty took over from the Li dynasty, the powerful man behind the Trung Tudou, remember I mentioned this in a previous lecture, he had all the men, all the senior men in the Li clan murdered. So there would be no Li rival to the Trung emperor. And if we make the assumption that a Dang, a political party in Vietnam, is a new form of an old clan, then this is just one clan, the Communist clan, getting rid of the other clans so that it has an unequaled opportunity to control. Ho Chi Minh and the French negotiate in Fontainebleau. De Gaulle is losing power in France over as 1946 is moving forward. The very conservative French Catholics and planters and business people here are gaining power. They basically sabotage the negotiations. The negotiations break down over the independence of Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh comes back in the fall of 46, and to be simplistic, two things happen. One, Ho Chi Minh suddenly stands up before the Vietnamese people and says, oh my God, the French are coming back, they want to conquer Vietnam again. Rally to me and we will fight the French. He having helped bring the French back. And then at the same time, the French show up and they say to the Vietnamese Catholics, landlords, conservatives, nationalists, anybody, say, oh my God, the Viet Minh, Ho Chi Minh, they're really communists. They're bringing class war to Vietnam. Rally to the French and we will help you protect your money, your property, and your lands. And Vietnam goes to war. Between the Viet Minh on one side against the French, and the French trying to organize some sort of way that they can hold on to power. And a new force comes up at this point called the Third Force. The Third Force is in the middle. And these are Vietnamese who say, we don't like either of this. Is there another alternative? If we go with the Viet Minh, we get ruled by the communists. If we go with the French, we sell out Vietnam. Now, most of the leaders who have been murdered by Ho Chi Minh and the French were leaders of the Third Force. So they have no leaders anymore. And remember what we said from time immemorial, Vietnamese organize around individuals. You can only mobilize Vietnamese if the right kind of individual. You have Duc, you have Tay, you have Viet Minh, there's something about you. So if there's no individual, the Vietnamese don't organize. Now, what we will see, starting at this period, right down through the end of the American War, is a constant pattern of assassination by the communists of individuals who could be leaders. Now, one of the ones whom I knew pretty well, Nguyen Van Bum, Professor Bong, he was assassinated. The guy who was #1 on the Lê Duong's hit list in the South was my mentor, Professor Huy. And they sent down a team to assassinate him in '71, but the police had penetrated the VC at that point and arrested them. So the pattern of communist aggression is not just large military units, it's individual assassinations. Teachers, village leaders, anybody who's good, who's strong, gets killed. Do Cao Tri, one of the best generals South Vietnam had, was taking off a helicopter at some point going into operation, and the helicopter, there's a bomb on it, blows up and kills Do Cao Tri. The other thing the communists have done there is there are other forms of assassination. There's political assassination. There's psychological assassination. There is compromising you. There's getting you in, there's turning your family against you, turning your wife against you, smearing you. So one of the ways the communists can build Tay for themselves is to bring down the Tay of other people. If I can destroy the Tay of my enemies, I will win in the long run. So the war starts. Now, very briefly, the French war is not very successful because they're not there fighting for the Vietnamese. They try fitfully to create some alliances from some nationalists. They bring Bao Dai back. There's a Bao Dai solution. An army is built up under the French. Vietnamese joined to fight against the communists under the French. In fact, there are more soldiers fighting for the French than they are for Ho Chi Minh. But it's, they don't fight with any great enthusiasm. A French general wants to solve it all by going up here to Dien Bien Phu and having one great big last battle and destroying all the Vietnamese communist forces. Dien Bien Phu is a little town in a valley surrounded by mountains. Now, what he does not predict is that in 1951, Mao Zedong has conquered China. So Ho Chi Minh has brought the Communist Party back. In all this time, he's never asked the Vietnamese people to fight for communism. But the Chinese then start giving guns, which are brought by the Vietnamese all the way down to surround Dien Bien Phu, cannons. And they shoot the airplanes out of the air so that there's no reinforcements. French General Navarre cannot reinforce his troops. He can't get supplies. Giap has his people dig tunnels, and they close in, and they win the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. And at that point, the French kind of give up. And when they give up, they go to a conference in Geneva in 1954 to reach an agreement to divide Vietnam. So that's the end of sort of the first war, the French War. And in the next lecture, we'll talk about what happens from the division until 1975. Thanks very much. Thank you again. For this final lecture, I want to talk about what we Americans call the Vietnam War, which begins with the division of Vietnam into North and South in 1954 and goes until 1975, really. And then, but there's the refugee story after 75, which brings so many Vietnamese in various stages to America to become Americans. But let's go back to 1954 and the division of Vietnam. The French War, the Viet Minh War, had actually ended it up kind of as a stalemate between the two forces, Ho Chi Minh's government of Vietnam and the French Union forces. The French had lost a big battle here, but more importantly, because of that, back in France, they lost the political will to carry on. They wanted a deal. Ho Chi Minh could not conquer, Viet Minh could not conquer the populated areas. So you had a situation, a classic guerrilla war situation, where the guerrillas control the countryside, the mountains and the jungles, and the government forces control the cities and the big towns. the philosophy that the Viet Minh had developed, the military philosophy, had been developed by General Giap, was called a people's war strategy. You organize the people in the hamlets and the villages, and bit by bit, step by step, you push back the government forces until the cities, until they basically finally give up and collapse, and you get to rule the country. Now, in a question of stalemate, the French wanted to get out, but a lot of the Vietnamese with them and others didn't want them to get out, and the communists didn't really have enough power to win. In that situation, Zhou Enlai, the sort of the #2 communist in China, proposed a deal. And the deal was to divide Vietnam in two. The communists would get full control of the north, the French would get full control of the south, and people could go back and forth. And that deal was accepted by the French, but objected to by the nationalist Vietnamese. Again, it was a second betrayal of the Vietnamese people by the French and the communists, cutting a deal which made sense for themselves. So Ho Chi Minh gets unconditional control of the north, and they can take over the south later, and the French get control of here, and there was a theory, I've heard, that the French wanted a couple of years to take their investments out and move them over to Algeria. And then they would just sort of abandon South Vietnam, and the communists would come down. In the Geneva Agreement of 1954, there were two parts to this. One was an armistice agreement between the French Union forces and Ho Chi Minh's government, in which both sides promised that they would not use their zone to attack the other zone. Separately, there was called the Geneva Declaration, which was a declaration of ideas which no nation signed. And in this declaration, it suggested that there would be elections in 2 years, 1956, on the unification of the two Vietnams. That becomes very important in the argument about the war. But the new South Vietnamese government, there's a new prime minister in South Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem, who's brought in by the Emperor Bao Dai. And Diem was this young man who was suggested to be prime minister in 1945, but the Japanese didn't pick him. He's been in exile for many years. He's a devout Catholic. He's a very rigorous man. He never marries. He spent years with the Maryknoll nuns, I think in New Jersey. But he's maintained a reputation among Vietnamese for he's got some duc. Whether he has wheat tin or not, unclear. But he's got some duc. So he comes back as the prime minister in 1954. Now the Americans, too, refused to accept the so-called Geneva Accords. They said, we are not bound by this promise to have elections in 1956. And in October 1954, President Eisenhower sends a letter to President Diem of Vietnam promising American support for an independent, non-communist South Vietnam. So here is where the Americans really enter in an important way. Earlier during the French War, we had provided some money and some weapons to the French, not because we supported the French in Vietnam, but because we needed them in Europe to join NATO. We were trying to organize the Europeans against the Russians in Europe, 52, 53, 54. And the French were saying, we will only join NATO and cooperate if you help us in Indochina. So the Americans, gritting their teeth, provided some French aid in Indochina. But when the French were having their big battle in Dien Bien Phu, they called on the Americans for B-52s or nuclear weapons, and President Eisenhower refused. He says, we're not going to bail the French out. Because fundamentally, we never supported the French. We wanted an independent Vietnam. But on October 23rd, 1954, President Eisenhower promises aid to South Vietnam, giving some Tay to the South Vietnamese. And a very important paragraph at the end of this letter. The government of the United States expects that this aid will be met by performance on the part of the government of Vietnam in undertaking needed reforms. It hopes that such aid, combined with your own continuing efforts, will contribute effectively towards an independent Vietnam endowed with a strong government. Such a government would, I hope, be so responsive to the nationalist aspirations of its people, so enlightened in purpose and effective in performance that it will be respected both at home and abroad, and discourage any who might wish to impose a foreign ideology on your free people. So what is the American strategy for South Vietnam in 1954? It's very simple. Nationalism. The Americans understand nationalism, this ancient tradition of the Vietnamese. We want to partner with Vietnamese nationalists. Not with colonialists, not with Confucians, but with the people. That's what our understanding is. And we knew about Vietnamese nationalism. We had American officials who understood it, who learned something about Vietnamese history. And by the way, the person who wrote this letter for President Eisenhower was my father. This is his language. Dad wrote these sentences. And Dad knew about Vietnamese nationalism, particularly from some Vietnamese he met in Geneva, Mr. Trung Van Do, who was the foreign minister under Diem, and Dad had met a number. Dad had also been in China in 37 and 38, and he'd been working in our government, State Department, Defense Department ever since. But the American objective was to give support to the third force, the nationalists, the Vietnamese people. Now, there's a commentary on this, and I'm sorry, I didn't bring the book. I didn't think about it until just now, which partially sets up the later anti-war movement. It's a book written by a British man. It's called The Quiet American. There's some movies about this you can see. And it's an attack on this American policy of supporting Diem and supporting the Vietnamese people by a British colonialist, Graham Greene. And his position is that Vietnamese only have two choices, the communists or the French. There is no nationalism, and the book gives a story about the so-called third force and the Cao Dai general, Trinh Minh Tay, and it makes the third force and the Cao Dai and Trinh Minh Tay look like either they're rascals or they're incompetent, they have no hope. And the protagonist is Howard Pyle, I think, a young American CIA agent and Harvard graduate. And Pyle is kind of a combination of Ed Lansdale, who was in Vietnam as the CIA guy, and my dad, who was the Harvard graduate. But Graham Greene's prediction that the Americans would fail turned out, sadly, to be true, maybe. Because we, the American people, never really understood the Vietnamese. And the Vietnamese were ultimately left with a choice between the communists and the French. And between those choices, the communists could win. So what happens after 1955? Well, from 54 to 55, Diem is prime minister, but he's very weak. And there's lots of political maneuverings. First of all, the French don't like him at all, because he doesn't like the French. There's one recorded conversation where he meets the French, the representative of the French government for the first time, and the Frenchman says, "Oh, Mr. President, it's so nice. We have so much in common." And Diem says, "What do we have in common?" And the French senior official says, "Well, we're both Catholic." And Diem says, "Oh, I always considered myself a Spanish Catholic." The French control the Binh Duong, a corrupt sort of mafia group in Saigon that runs drugs and prostitutes and gambling dens and stuff like that. They're messing around. They have bribed some of the forces from the Wahao and the Cao Dai, and they're trying to challenge Diem. Diem's trying to put together an army. There are 1 million refugees who've come down from North Vietnam, mostly Catholic, 80% Catholic. They're trying to be resettled. They got to resettle them. He's trying to put together a government. He's got lots of stress and strain. And originally, he has an alliance. The alliance is with some Dai Viet, some Wahao, and some Cao Dai. But problems begin to emerge with Diem, which will ultimately bring down his government and compromise South Vietnam, which is his family. There are 3 members of his family which will prove to be not helpful. One is an older brother, the Archbishop Thuc, devout Catholic. Another is the younger brother, Nhu, Ngodi Nhu, who becomes the advisor and the manipulator next to Diem. And the third is Madame Nhu, Nhu's wife. But what happens starting in late 54, 55 is that Nhu wants to set up and he has support from his brother, and he goes to Diem, their own political party, their own Dang. They don't want to rule in coalition. They've got a coalition. But bit by bit, Nhieu sabotages things. An offer was made to the southern leader of the Dai Viet party to become Minister of Defense. Diem decided, met with him, said, you become Minister of Defense. Nhieu was supposed to convey the official offer to join the cabinet. Nhieu never made the phone call, never had the meeting. This is what the Dai Viet guys told me. Nguyen Ton Wang was his name, never got invited. The Dai Viets get pushed out. Nhieu has this is not, we don't know this for certain, but it's suspected. Nhieu has the Cao Dai general, Trinh Minh Tay, assassinated. There's a fight and Tay is shot in the back of the head. Not by the guys on the other side, but somebody on his own side shoots him in the back of the head. So bit by bit, Nhieu removes people around Diem, and they put together a ruling apparatus based on refugees from the north and Catholics, and landlord families from the south. Catholics from the south, but also landlord families. And they set up a party called the Kung Lao Party. Dang, Kung Lao. And the Kung Lao Party has an ideology. Nhieu is really aping the communists. But he's not tapping into Vietnamese nationalism, because the ideology of the Kung Lao Party is sort of left-wing Catholic thought and a Catholic Confucian notion of Nhung Vi, of personal status, of personal integrity, which echoes Neo-Confucian ideas of morality. In other words, Diem, whose family also was a Nguyen dynasty Mandarin family from here, tries to replicate the Nguyen dynasty strategy for rule, which is a combination of Tay and a combination of ideology. But the ideology is sort of ersatz. Nobody believes in it. It's just sort of made up. And his Tay is the police, the army, and the Americans. But he's fairly successful. By '59, he has established a government. He's pushed back against the communists. The refugees have been resettled. There's a land reform program, which is beginning to take away some of the land from the great landlords' families. The great landlord families are all down here. They have huge estates. And bit by bit, Diem is trying to take them away. He's organizing things. He has a government that works. He's building up an army. He has American aid. And we get to 1959. A couple of things happened in 1959. But first, I want to go back up to North Vietnam and talk a little bit about Ho Chi Minh. What kind of a man was Ho Chi Minh? I don't think we really know much yet. They tried to communize North Vietnam, and they tried to bring class warfare. 57, 58, they had a huge land reform program, and they had a program of Tokho where people were invited, incited to accuse the bad elements, the capitalist elements, the landlord class, the mean people. So you'd gather all the villagers around, and people would stand up and accuse friends, relatives, others, rival families. And if you got accused of being greedy or selfish, you'd be punished, either killed or you'd be disciplined or your land taken away. That led to a big revolt down here in '58. It was a big revolt in Ha Tinh, Nghệ An. And then Ho Chi Minh, the Communist Party, had to retreat from imposing this communism. And they blamed a guy by the name of Trung Chin, and Ho Chi Minh steps up. But what I think is very significant, we'll learn more of this later, is that apparently, about 1958, Ho Chi Minh had a wife, and she had a son with Ho Chi Minh. And the wife's name, her name was Xuân, which is known as Nom Thi Xuân, I think. She was a hill tribe girl from up here, and she'd been sent down to be Ho Chi Minh's mistress. There'd been a number of these women. But she apparently asked him to marry, and he agreed. So she was a wife, and she had a son whose name is Trum, I think, Nguyen Thach Trum, who's still alive in Hanoi. And anyway, first of all, one day the Minister of Public Security, Trung Quoc Wang, comes by the little flat where she is and rapes her and then murders her. And they dump her her body on a street in Hanoi. And these are the letters written by some friends of her younger sister, because the younger sister is also killed, and the younger sister's husband is also killed. So these are letters written in 1983 to Nguyen Hu Ta, Chủ tịch Quốc hội, the head of the National Assembly of Vietnam, on behalf of the family of Nguyen Thi Vang, who is the younger sister of Co Xuân. So what kind of a national leader are you when your Minister of Security will rape your wife and kill her? So something's going on. Now, at this point, I want to have a transition, another transition to the American anti-war movement, because there's this image of Ho Chi Minh that by the late 50s has become prominent abroad, that he is a great leader of Vietnam. He's the George Washington of Vietnam, and he's not a communist, that he's a nationalist. And that thinking goes back to these two books. This cover is gone, particularly this book by Jean Saint-Denis. Saint-Denis was the French guy who cut the deal with Ho Chi Minh in '46, and he spent the rest of his life defending that deal. And the premise for that deal was that Ho Chi Minh was a nationalist who could work with the French, and that he was the great leader of Vietnam. So this is the history of a lost peace. In this book, written in the early 50s, Saint-Denis says, we French could have won if we'd followed my advice and done a deal with Ho Chi Minh. Because you didn't follow my advice and you started fighting Ho Chi Minh, you lost, and it's all your fault, it's not my fault. I was right. And then there was this book by Paul Meuse, Vietnam, Sociologie d'une Guerre, Vietnam, Sociology of a War. And this is where Paul Meuse comes up with his thesis that, this is 1952, the first edition, 1952. And it's dedicated to friendship, à la amitié. And this is where Meuse puts out his thesis that, oh yeah, we got this chapter, Descartes and Confucius, patriotism, Vietnam men, the chance of an Asian Marxism, the chances of a traditional monarchy, and what to do. I mean, this is where he, oh yeah, the cosmology of Marxism. I mean, here's a French sort of scholar up in the air making the case that the Vietnamese are really Marxist. You take away the Neo-Confucianism, they become Marxist. Now, ladies and gentlemen, these two books, plus some others, become the basis for the American anti-war movement. The American anti-war movement rests on French colonial misperceptions about the Vietnamese. And none of the brilliant American scholars who led the movement, who got so furious, were smart enough to figure out that they were wrong, that all they were doing were following these French guys. But I'll get to that when we get to the 1960s. 1959, I said two things happen. The major thing happens in Hanoi. There's the 15th plenum of the Communist Party in May, which decides to conquer South Vietnam. And remember, the North has signed an agreement never to use the North to attack the South. Diem has set up an independent government here, which is solid. And there were no elections in 1956. That was used by the anti-war movement, saying the North got cheated. There were supposed to be elections. But nobody really agreed to the elections, and I argue there was no commitment to hold the elections. But in 1959, the Party Central Committee holds its 15th plenum, May. The plenum reviewed the situation in our country since the signing of the Geneva Agreements and set forth the revolutionary lines of the nation as a whole and for the South. In order to attain the basic path of development of revolution in the South is to use violence. Hanoi decides to go to war against South Vietnam in May 1959. Hanoi is not provoked. There is no legitimate reason to go to war against South Vietnam. They just want to conquer it. And according to the specific situation and the present requirements of the revolution, the line of using violence is using the strength of the masses and relying principally on the political forces of the masses. In other words, people's war. They're going to fight a people's war in the South. And then they form Group 559. Group 559 is the military group which sets up the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They set up Group 559 to bring supplies to support the effort in the war in the South. And then they set up, where is it? I think in September, they set up Group 959, which is to take over Laos. So the Vietnamese communists decided to go in to bring the war into Laos. And then they there was a third group, which was the group to bring supplies by sea into South Vietnam. Now, this is very important because it gets to the great argument over the American war, which is what was the origin of the war? The American government argued aggression. The American government and the South Vietnamese argued aggression, illegal war brought by Hanoi against the South. Hanoi, the NLF, and the anti-war movement argued there was no aggression. It was a spontaneous revolt of peasants in South Vietnam against the repressive Ngo Dinh Diem regime supported by the Americans. It was the people, the poor, oppressed people of South Vietnam against the Catholics, the landlords, corrupt generals, and a bossy family with Ngo Dinh Diem. And therefore, if it's aggression under international law, we Americans can go help South Vietnam. If it's an internal rebellion, we have no business in South Vietnam. That was the argument all during the Vietnam War. The American government had one position. It was aggression. Now, I mentioned there was a second thing in 1959, which makes things more complicated. That the Diem government, at the urging of his sister-in-law, Madame Nhieu, passed what was known as the family law, which was to outlaw divorce. No divorce in Vietnam based on Catholic religious teachings. Now, the story I heard, and I met one of the guys, Mr. Zhao, in Paris, is that Madame Nhieu had a younger sister, and she was married to a Mr. Nguyen Van Zhao. But she was having an affair with, I think, the Italian naval attaché. Okay? So her husband, Mr. Zhao, was going to divorce her. Right? So you're my wife, you're having an affair with some other guy, I'm out of this marriage. This would have been an embarrassment to the Ngo family. So the sister, Madame Nhieu, gets the president to pass a law that there can be no divorce to protect her sister's reputation. And since the government controlled the national parliament, they did that. It was a silly little law, but it was a trigger for the symbolism that the Ngo family was ruling Vietnam not to help the people, but just for its own reasons. It's Kung Lao party, the Ngo family, they were a little kind of elite power structure, and they didn't care about the people. And they had alienated the Dai Viets, the VNQDD, the Wahao, the Cao Dai, and they were going to alienate the Buddhists. And if you alienate a whole bunch of people, and you got the communists coming in to attack you, you're going to be in trouble. So what happens? After the 15th plenum, the war starts growing in South Vietnam. And various incidents in Binh Tre, there's an uprising in Binh Tre. There are various other things start to happen. There's some fighting starts up in here. In September 1960, there is the third Congress of the Vietnamese Communist Party. And the third Congress approves the decision of the 15th plenum the year before, that the new strategy is to conquer South Vietnam by force. And the third Congress calls for a liberation movement. In December 1960, the NLF, the National Liberation Front for South Vietnam, is formed in the jungles of Tay Ninh up here in December 1960. Now, the American anti-war movement argues that the NLF was the voluntary, spontaneous uprising of the South Vietnamese people against a cruel and corrupt government. The US government said the NLF was a puppet and front organization created by the communists in Hanoi to fight a people's war. Now, let me comment briefly again on the strategy of people's war, which Giap used, and it goes back to Mao Zedong, but it is fundamentally any guerrilla war. Iraq today, the Taliban in Afghanistan and Pakistan today, it's you mobilize the people in order to strike here and there wherever the enemy is weak. In a people's war, you never have big battles. You never really try to win big battles. The whole strategy of a people's war is you're trading space for time. What you want is time. Guerrilla wars are won by having a long time and you wear down the will of your opponent. Ultimately, they just can't keep fighting. They have more soldiers, more tanks, more money than you, but at the end, they get exhausted and they give up. In order to gain time, you give up space, which means you retreat back. You go back to the jungles, you go back to the mountains, you go wherever you can. Secondly, you hide among the people. Mao Zedong, very importantly, said, the guerrillas are the fish who swim in the sea of the people. If we assume I'm a government agent or I'm an American lieutenant, think of, in the current context, a village in Afghanistan. You all are villagers in a village in Afghanistan, right? I'm an American trying to figure out which one of you are the Taliban. One of you, several of you, you're real Taliban, you've got guns hidden in your house, or you're spies for the Taliban. And I have a meeting, and I have you all, and my guys go around the village, my guys with guns, they bring you all together, we're in some house, and I'm talking to you, and I'm trying to figure out who's with the Taliban. I'm going to fail. There's no way I'm really going to figure out, right? Secondly, what tends to happen in guerrilla wars is I make mistakes. I think he's a Taliban guy. I'm absolutely convinced of it, so I take him out and shoot him. He's actually not Taliban at all. He's actually my friend. He's the Taliban guy. Now I've got everybody mad at me, and you all think I'm stupid because I shot the wrong man. So if you can get the guerrillas inside the people, the enemy cannot get them out. And it's like an infestation. They stay there year in, year out. Trading up space, give up space for time. The Vietnamese communists had defeated the French with the same strategy, and they want to use it against the Americans. Now, the American response. First of all is we have President Kennedy is elected in 1960. I'll read something from him in a second. 1961, he sends some advisors to go to Vietnam to decide what to do. And they recommend increasing American assistance to Ngo Dinh Diem's government because Hanoi is attacking. And they publish a paper, a white paper, called The Threat to Peace. This is the justification in 1961 by the United States government of helping South Vietnam. And it talks about the use of terror, it talks about direction of the Viet Cong by North Vietnam. This is a paper that claims that this is an illegal aggression. My dad called it aggression by seepage because the communists had also learned a lesson from Korea. The lesson of Korea is that if you invade over a border, you violate international law and you justify the Americans and the UN coming to push you back. But if you create a Ho Chi Minh Trail and you come in by sea and you organize local people here, you haven't invaded over a border. You get to argue that this is a legitimate rebellion of oppressed people. Very clever. You hide the real power, you hide the real agenda behind a front organization. Now then, several years later, as the Americans are going to escalate, 1965, the State Department came up with another justification for the effort. It's called aggression from the North. The record of North Vietnam's campaign to conquer South Vietnam. And on page 3, they claim the infiltration rate has been increasing. From 1959 to 1960, when Hanoi was establishing its infiltration pipeline, at least 1,800 men, excuse me, Wow, could you come up? I'm going to do something. 1,800 men and possibly 2,700 more moved into South Vietnam from the north. Could you put these numbers year? 59 to 60, 1,800, possibly 2,700 more. 1961, they sent down 3,700, and at least 5,462. 59-60 was 1,800, and 61 was Ba Ngang Bai, 62, 5,400. For 64, the evidence is still incomplete, minimum of 4,400.
64.
No, 63 là 4.200. 64 it says a minimum of 4,400 and maybe another 3,000. So when the anti-war movement is getting organized in 65, and they say this is wrong. They say the American government is wrong. There was no real infiltration from North Vietnam. Now, this is a document from Hanoi's Ministry of Defense. It doesn't have a date on it, but it's after the war was over. And this was given to me by Viet Minh, who was a former leading communist who came out in France. So this is a document, and it says the number of soldiers who were new soldiers who were sent south towards South Vietnam. This is Hanoi's record of how many people they sent south. So why could you? Okay, in 1959, they sent 542 plus 1217. Plus 1217, so 1,700. They sent 1,750. Total 1,750. So the American CIA was off by about 50 people. Okay? In 1961, they sent 5,521. We were down by, they sent more than we thought. Okay? 1963, they sent 8,719. Twice as many as we thought. In 1964, by the end of the year, they sent 17,474 people into South Vietnam. We argue there was only like maybe 7,000. Now, how many people before the Vietnam War was over, how many North Vietnamese were sent south? Anybody want to guess? According to Hanoi? 976,849, almost 1 million people. 976,849. You send 1 million people from here to here, I call that an invasion. This is their number. This is not some American CIA or anything. This is their number. Now another thing about who set up the NLF? Who started the war in the South? Well, this is a document that was also given to me. This says the History Institute, the Military History Institute of Vietnam. And this in handwritten, it says, presented to 4-star General Vuong Nguyen Giap. This is a copy of a report which was personally presented to General Giap and made its way out. And it's the summary of the study of the resistance war against the Americans to save the nation of the Vietnamese people. And the critical thing is, on page 28, it talks about number 2, đường lối cách mạng của Đảng và cuộc đấu tranh của nhân dân miền Nam trong giai đoạn mới. The road of the revolution of the party and the struggle of the people of the South in this new period. And it says that the party conference, the third party conference of the party met in September 1960 to set out the revolutionary road for the entire nation. The way of the Cách mạng xã hội chủ nghĩa, the way of socialist revolution in the north, and the way of revolution in the south. And then, down here, this is their document. I'll read it in Vietnamese first. Theo đường lối của đại hội, ngày 20 tháng 12 1960, Mặt trận Dân tộc Giải phóng miền Nam được thành lập. Following the road of the party congress, on December 20th, 1960, the NLF, the Mặt trận Dân tộc Giải phóng miền Nam, was established. So this is Hanoi saying the NLF was established to implement the Communist Party orders. The whole thing was a setup by the communists in Hanoi. It had nothing to do with any spontaneous rebellion of the people here. And the American people today still don't believe that. The myth of Ho Chi Minh as a nationalist, as a good guy, of the oppressed Vietnamese standing up against Ngo Dinh Diem is what most Americans, if they remember anything about the Vietnam War, that's sort of in there. And if you believe that, then there's no reason for the Americans to fight in Vietnam, right? It's not our business. So what happens next? There is briefly in December 1960, before the Kennedy administration comes into office, there's a coup d'etat against Diem in Saigon, led by some of the Dai Viet military officers in the Marines and the airborne, primarily the airborne, because elite opinion in Saigon, people like Nyuklid, Nguyen Tuong Tam, and other Dai Viets have concluded that Diem, his brothers and his sisters, can't win. Hanoi has declared war. And the Diem family can't win. They got to go. And so there's a coup, but the army vacillates. And there are only a few units who go after Diem, and several, Trung Tin Kim, a Catholic, too. Kim is a Dai Viet, but he's also a Catholic. And his whole life, he switches back and forth depending on what's good for Kim at any given time, frankly. And so he comes to the rescue of Diem, and the regime stays in power, and the Americans decide to support it. Now, what is the philosophy behind the American support of South Vietnam? That's been argued a lot in our history and among the American anti-war movement. Let's look at some very clear facts. There's no oil in South Vietnam. There's no gold. There was nothing there for Americans to fight for. Right? Absolutely nothing. Even today, with all the drilling out here, not a lot of oil is coming out. Why would we do this? Why would we go thousands of miles away to fight for people who aren't even our own people? Has to be something intellectual, some vision. And I suggest that it's caught up in President Kennedy's inaugural address, which reflects the spirit and the purpose of the American people during the Cold War. And this is what he said, January 20th, 1961. Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike, that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans, born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace, proud of our ancient heritage, and unwilling to witness or permit the slow undoing of those human rights to which this nation has always been committed, and to which we are committed today at home and around the world. And this is part of the key paragraph. Let every nation know, whether it wishes as well or ill, that's the Soviet Union, that's Hanoi, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, in order to assure the survival and success of liberty. This much we pledge and more. And then another paragraph specifically talking about Vietnam. Now the trumpet summons us again, not as a call to bear arms, though arms we need, not as a call to battle, though embattled we are, but a call to bear the burden of a long twilight struggle, year in and year out, rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation, a struggle against the common enemies of man, tyranny, poverty, disease, and war itself. And then the famous lines, and so my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. So in that spirit, John Kennedy decided he could not back down from Vietnam. When his decisions were made at the end of 1961, there were two other circumstances that had occurred. One, there had been a political instability in Laos, and a pro-Western government had sort of been overthrown, and there was, the Russians had come in, and the North Vietnamese were coming in, and there was instability. By the way, that was when the Hmong leader, General Vang Pao, first came to we recruited Vang Pao at this time, 61, to help us in Laos. And that's why we have all the Hmong people here, when we lost the war. The issue was whether we could send American troops into Laos. And the military leaders told Kennedy we could not send the troops. He had no options in Laos because there are no air bases, there's no way to reinforce, there's no way to supply. So he had to compromise with the communists in Laos. This is though, even though Eisenhower, when Eisenhower, on Kennedy's inaugural day, when he read this speech, when he and Eisenhower met, Eisenhower only had one, in the White House, only one word of advice for Kennedy, which was Laos. Said if you lose Laos, you're going to lose Southeast Asia, because the mountains are here. You got to secure Laos, and Kennedy never did, and Johnson never did. And that's probably the biggest reason on the ground we could not defeat Hanoi. We had to fall back on other things. So Kennedy had not prevailed in Laos. Secondly, he had a brutal meeting with Khrushchev in Vienna in '61. And Khrushchev had apparently just kind of growled at him and bullied him. And Kennedy left that meeting both personally feeling that he was kind of inadequate, and the reputation was out there that he was too weak to deal with Khrushchev. So it is argued by Kennedy supporters that he didn't really want to fight in Vietnam. He was pushed into it to show that he could be tough. He needed to show some place that he could be tough against the communists in the Cold War, and he decided to stand in South Vietnam. And the policy was called sink or swim with Ngo Dinh Diem. The decision was made to work with Diem and his government and try to hold off the communists. Now, what happens is under Diem, from 59 to 63 is a mixed record of 61 to 63 is a mixed record of success. Diem has American aid. He comes up with a strategy called strategic hamlets. They build up South Vietnamese forces. Helicopters are out there, and it is argued by many that they stabilize the situation, particularly in the rural areas in central Vietnam. But fate has a way of catching up with you. In 1963, Diem's brother, Archbishop Thup, who has spent most of his career down in Vinh Long here, moves back to Hue, the family seat, which is dominated primarily by Buddhists. It is said by some, but who knows what the truth is, that his ambition was to become a cardinal in the Catholic Church. And the best way for him to achieve this was to convert a lot of Vietnamese to be Catholics by building up the Catholic Church. That would win him brownie points with the Vatican. He'd get to be a cardinal. In any case, the man for the family who's been running things in central Vietnam has been the youngest brother who stayed home with the mother, who's quite elderly, and is getting along with all the Buddhist priests and just going along with the different factions. The archbishop arrives back there and changes the rules of the game. So, for example, there's a rule in Vietnam that only the national flag can be flown. You can't fly the flag of the Buddhists or the Catholics or the Wahao or the Cao Dai or other political parties. But it turns out that, and I don't know quite the reason for this, but either it's Archbishop Thup's birthday or it's Easter or something like this, suddenly around Hue they fly the Catholic flag, which is yellow and white, right? It's got the papal hat on it. So various Buddhist monks who don't like Diem to begin with, who form a group called the Ân Quang faction, they demand the right to fly the Buddhist flag, which has got different colored bars, short and long bars. And so they do this, and then the province chief is kind of caught, and then the orders come out, you can't let the Buddhists fly their flag, so they try to take the flag down. There's a demonstration, the troops are sent out, people are milling around, and somebody throws a grenade. And to this day, I don't think anybody knows who throws the grenade. Whether it was the South Vietnamese troops, whether it was a communist agitator, who knows? Anyway, a number of people are killed. The Buddhists then mount a protest against Diem, demanding apologies and also concessions. Diem, for his side, refuses to concede, and the political tension escalates. And a Buddhist monk in Saigon, several months later, commits suicide in the street by pouring gas. His disciples pour gasoline over him and they light him. So suddenly there's a picture on the cover of American magazines of a Buddhist monk burning himself to death in protest against the government that we're supporting. So the issue then becomes, for the Americans, do we stay with Diem? Do we try to overthrow him? What do we do? And the opinion of the American government is completely split. There's a small group of experienced people who basically say, whether we like it or not, we better stay with Diem because there is no alternative. There's no other leader, there's no other general, there's nobody. There's another group of people egged on by journalists in Saigon, like David Halberstam, who say, you got to get rid of Diem. He's lost the support of the people. he's a dictator. And then there's a bunch of people who don't know what to do. At this time, wheels start turning on the South Vietnamese side. There are two separate groups who start planning a coup. One are some, again, nationalist officers, Dai Viet, VNQDD, Marine officers, led by a core group of younger officers, people like Nguyen Van Ton, Yung Hyung Nghĩa. And then there's a senior group of generals, sort of French-educated generals. Ton Thuc Dinh, Truong Van Lam, Big Minh, Dung Van Minh, some others. And the generals get in touch with the Americans. And they say, we're thinking about a coup. What do you want us to do? And the Americans in Washington decide, keep in touch, but don't give any clues. But one of the conditions comes over from the senior generals. It says, only talk to us. Don't talk to any other Vietnamese. So there's an American guy, Lou Conin, who's originally a Corsican, who comes from the OSS, who's the liaison with the top generals. And there is, however, New makes a mistake towards the end of '63. He has the police raid some Buddhist pagodas, beat up some Buddhist monks. The lead monk escapes, but New now has a really bad reputation in the States. Oh, Madame New, his wife, is quoted as talking about barbecues, that if more monks want to barbecue themselves, let them. The Americans think this is appallingly callous. And how can we support somebody like that? A new ambassador is sent out to Saigon, Cabot Lodge, who thinks his job is to get rid of Diem. So Cabot Lodge begins to manipulate with some people back in Washington, Averell Harriman, Hillsman, and they push American policy to support the coup. And sort of certain green lights are given, and the coup is executed on November 1, 1963. And the purpose of the coup is to get rid of New in particular, but also Diem. Diem's last phone call to Lodge sort of says, what is the position of the American government? And Lodge says, I think something like, well, we're prepared to take you out of Vietnam if you want. And Diem says, well, no, I will continue to do my duty as long as I can. Oh, by the way, on this, my dad had known Diem and New. My dad was responsible for Southeast Asian affairs in the late 50s. In 62 or 63, Dad was ambassador in Bangkok. We were living there, and he went over to Saigon, and he called on Diem. He had a private conversation with Diem. And he told me that at the end of the long talk, it was on the second floor, Diem walked him out of the room, and the stairs sort of curved down to the first floor like this. And as Dad was sort of beginning to go down the stairs, Diem said to him and said something like, say goodbye. Ken, rest assured that I will do my duty until, and he went like this, which, was, I think, on one hand, it was a sign of dedication. On the other hand, it was stubbornness, just pure stubbornness, Vietnamese Lee. He really was Lee. He was going to go on until somebody shot him. And that's probably not the best thing to do when you're the leader of a country under attack by the communists. Anyway, in the coup, he and his brother managed to escape from the presidential residence by a tunnel. They get into a car, they drive down to a church in Cha Lung. And one of the issues, again, surrounding all this is whether the CIA had any role in Diem's murder. The story that I have heard is that Diem and New are in this church in Cha Lung. They phone in to the coup leaders. And the coup leaders were particularly Big Minh, Dung Van Minh. And there was another guy, another general, Mai Hu Xuân. Mai Hu Xuân was the head of the police. And there were several other generals. And so Big Minh arranges, we'll come pick you up. The brothers surrender. So Big Minh and Mai Hu Xuân and somebody else go into a little room back here. And then they come back out. And a Major Nhung, who is the aide-de-camp of Big Minh, is going to go pick up the brothers and bring them back. And another guy, Colonel Nghĩa, who was my friend and a leading Tung Dai Viet, said that when Big Minh comes out, he came out of the room like this, and he put 2 fingers over his belt buckle, which was 2 people, kill 2 people. So in the room, the generals had decided to kill Diem too. So anyway, Colonel Nghia has the group of he's leading the small group of APCs, armored M113s, armored personnel carriers. They go down, pick up Diem and Nhu. They're in the APC with Major Nhum. On the way back to the headquarters, both men are murdered and stabbed to death. And the guy driving the APC up top is looking down this, goes on the radio to Nghia, who's in the Jeep at the front of us, said they're killing the two people. And Nghia says, do your duty and keep going. So that's what happened. Diem's government is overthrown by a coup. The power is taken over by sort of these senior French generals, and the situation in Vietnam begins to rapidly decay and collapse. Without a leader, the Vietnamese don't know what to do. Across the country, village guards show up and they turn back their guns. And people and army soldiers desert. There's no leadership. And Hanoi's response is to escalate. Don't have a compromise, but to escalate. In January '64, there is a mini coup where the Tung Dai Viets in particular, Nghia, Nguyen Van Ton, Professor Huy, Pham Thai, and others, stage a mini coup, and they get rid of 4 of the French generals because de Gaulle has sent 2 French agents, Vietnamese who work for the French, back to work out a surrender to Hanoi, to work out a neutralist government of the South to give in. And these guys don't want to do that, so they take these 4 generals and they take them out of power and they put them up in Dalat, and that's the end of the French attempt to, again, cut a deal with the communists. However, they do bring in as prime minister, well, they end up leaving Big Min as the chief of state. It's a funny story about all this, but I don't have time to tell you. They put in as prime minister a general by the name of Nguyen Canh. Turns out to be a big mistake. Nguyen Canh, who's still alive, and he goes around and gives speeches at conferences, he becomes a very manipulative, divisive kind of personality, 64 and 65. Now, what happens in 64, as you can see, in 64, the communists respond by sending 17,000 people south. In 65, they respond by sending 46,000 soldiers south. So the communists are escalating up as the situation in the South gets weaker. The Americans bring over a new commander, General Westmoreland. We also have some ambassadors. Basically, the situation in 64 is unraveling, slowly unraveling against the Saigon government's ability to control the countryside. And VC units are being increased in size, up to battalion sizes, hundreds of men in one unit. The North Vietnamese forces start entering in 65. By 65, there have been a number of coups d'etats led by these Tung Dai Viet officers to get rid of Nguyen Canh. Finally, in early 65, they succeed and he's exiled. And so there's a little bit more stable government. But by June 1965, the communist forces, North Vietnamese units which have come in, but a lot of Viet Cong units, are now defeating South Vietnamese battalions 1 a week. So you get to June 1965, and Westmoreland reports back to Washington that at this rate, South Vietnam is lost by the end of the summer. There are no young men, there's no draft in South Vietnam, there are no soldiers in the training camps. They're losing a battalion a week, they've only got like 10 battalions left, it's only a matter of time, there's no more South Vietnamese army. So additional forces are necessary to save the country, particularly they thought the communists wanted to split the country in 2 right here. Now, the American strategy had been adopted by McNamara and by McGeorge Bundy. The American strategy was to put pressure on Hanoi to convince the communists to give up and leave South Vietnam alone. Unbeknownst to the Americans, this strategy was stupid, because this strategy played right into the hands of Lê Duan and the communists. It was all about Tay. We were going to try to squeeze and hurt the North Vietnamese. As long as they could stand up to our pressure, they could continue the war. And at some point, we would give up and go home. We played right into their hands. Our brilliant Harvard-educated people, McNamara and McGeorge Bundy and others. And the lesson they had learned was from the Cuban Missile Crisis with the Russians. The scientific gradual application of pressure, more and more and more until the other side says, ouch, I give up. But the communists, because they think, the Vietnamese communists, because they think in terms of Tay, they realized that the American threat was basically a bluff. Because in the last analysis, as long as Hanoi could control the population up here and keep sending 20, 30,000 young North Vietnamese a year down into the South, they could keep the war going forever. So they weren't particularly scared. So first we start a bombing campaign against the North, and then in July 1965, President Johnson has to agree to send 44 maneuver battalions, main force American combat battalions, into Vietnam on an emergency basis to halt the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong activity and buy time for South Vietnam. Again, we're talking about a trade-off of space and time. In order to buy time for Saigon, we had to push the North Vietnamese out to the borders. We had to expand the space of control of the government to give it time. So we have, at the end of '65, when the Americans really get involved in the war, we have the communists trading space for time, and we're trading, in effect, time for space. We're moving fast in order to get space. So the whole question of the war turns out on time. Who can last longer? And we'll continue with this in the next lecture.